Welcome back to Sleep Theories. A huge thank you to Stuart for suggesting tonight's story. I love when the community drives where we go next, and this one did not disappoint. If you have a topic you would love to hear covered here, drop it in the comments below. Every suggestion gets read, and you might just hear your idea turn into the next documentary. And if Sleep Theories has become part of your nighttime routine, a quick review on Spotify would mean the world. It takes about 30 seconds, and it is genuinely one of the best ways to help new listeners find their way to us. Now, let us begin. Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight, a genuine thank you to everyone who's been leaving comments about your locations and time zones. It means the world to know that voices from Tokyo and Toronto and Cape Town and Manchester are all finding their way here, settling in for the night, letting these stories carry them somewhere else for a little while. If you are new here, drop your location in the comments below. We love knowing where in the world you're listening from, and if Sleep Theories has become part of your nighttime routine, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify. It helps more than you know, and every single one gets read. Now, tonight's story is unlike most of the cases we have covered here. It does not begin with a body, or a crash, or a moment of catastrophic violence. It begins with a knock at the door, a polite knock, a well-dressed woman on the step, a clipboard under her arm, a smile that seems entirely professional. She introduces herself as being from the council, from social services, here about the children. And then she asks, quite calmly, if she might step inside and speak with your child alone. That is where the story begins. That is where, for dozens of families across Great Britain during the 1980s and 1990s, something shifted. That is the moment people would remember for decades afterward, not because of what happened next, but because of what could not be explained about what came before. The case has no official name. There is no Scotland Yard file with a suspect profile attached to it. There is no conviction, no inquest, no resolved outcome. What there is, what has always been there, buried in local newspaper archives and dusty council records and the long memories of ordinary people, is a pattern. A pattern so consistent, so geographically widespread and so stubbornly unexplained that it has become one of the most quietly unnerving social mysteries of late 20th century Britain. Investigators, journalists and amateur researchers have taken to calling it simply the phantom social worker. To understand why this case matters, why it disturbs even those who come to it decades later with fresh eyes, you have to understand the particular vulnerability that was being exploited, or, if the official explanation is correct, the particular fear that took root in the minds of an entire generation of British parents. Because the 1980s were not a simple time to be a family in the United Kingdom. Social services were not a simple thing to be involved with, and the relationship between ordinary households and the machinery of government welfare was charged in those years, with a tension that few people today fully appreciate. This is the story of the phantom social worker, and when you hear everything that was reported, everything that was documented and then quietly lost and then partially recovered, you will have to decide for yourself what you believe happened. Tonight, we are going to go all the way to the beginning. The earliest credible reports surface in North London sometime in the early 1980s. The precise year is difficult to pinpoint because the initial incidents were not treated as significant enough to warrant formal investigation. They were recorded as neighbourhood complaints, filed, locally and largely forgotten within weeks. But the families who experienced them did not forget. Several of these accounts were later reconstructed through interviews conducted by local journalists and community organisations during the years that followed, and they share a remarkable uniformity of detail that, viewed in retrospect, is one of the most striking aspects of the entire phenomenon. The visitor was a woman, always a woman, in the earliest reports. She appeared to be in her 30s or 40s, well presented, dressed in the kind of smart but unremarkable clothing that suggests professionalism without ostentation. She carried either a clipboard or a folder of documents. Witnesses differed on the precise form, and she spoke with the measured, slightly formal tone that people in that era associated with council workers, NHS visitors, and government officials of every kind. She said she was from social services. She said she was following up on a welfare concern that had been raised about the family, She asked to come in. Most families, confronted with this presentation at their own front door, let her in. This was not naive. This was not a failure of judgment. In the Britain of the early 1980s, a visit from social services was not something most working-class or middle-class families felt empowered to challenge or refuse. The machinery of the welfare state carried an implicit authority, and the idea that refusing to cooperate with a social worker could itself be used as evidence against you, evidence that you had something to hide, something to protect your children from scrutiny about, was a very real and very reasonable fear. So people let her in. They made tea, perhaps. They sat down. And then she said something that made the atmosphere in the room change. She needed to speak with the children alone. She said this as though it were routine, as though this was simply how these assessments were conducted, as though a mother or father remaining in the room while a stranger spoke privately with their child was somehow unusual, somehow improper, somehow contrary to professional procedure. And this is the moment, this precise moment, where the accounts begin to diverge in their outcomes but remain completely unified in their emotional texture. Because every family who reported this encounter described the same thing, a cold, vertiginous sense that something was deeply wrong. Some parents complied. They stepped out of the room, into the kitchen, into the hallway, for what they were told would be only a few minutes. Others refused. They said they would stay. They asked for identification. And this is where the second extraordinary detail of the pattern emerges. When challenged, when a parent asked to see a badge, a council letter, some official documentation, the woman's response was not irritation, not insistence, not the kind of professional firmness you might expect from someone being questioned in the legitimate exercise of their duties. Her response was retreat. Swift, clean, almost practiced retreat. She would say something vague, that she must have the wrong address, or that she would need to come back with the correct paperwork, and then she would leave, quickly, before the parent had time to ask anything further, before anyone could note down a registration plate or confirm a department name. She was gone. Those parents who reported the encounter to their local police stations found that officers took the details down politely and did very little else. There was no known welfare concern on record at the council. There was no visit scheduled. There was no employee whose description matched the woman's. And since no crime had been committed, since the woman had simply knocked on a door, asked some questions and left, there was limited appetite within overstretched local police forces to treat the matter as a serious investigation. The reports were logged. They were filed. And they were, for the most part, forgotten. But the pattern did not stop. Through the mid-1980s, similar reports began emerging from across the country with a frequency that, taken together, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. In the Midlands, a woman matching the description spent several weeks working through a particular estate in Wolverhampton, calling on families with young children, asking the same questions, retreating at the same moment of challenge. In Yorkshire, parents in at least 3 separate towns reported near-identical encounters within a span of several months. In South London, a community newsletter published a warning specifically advising parents to ask for credentials before allowing any unannounced social worker into their homes, a warning prompted by a cluster of unverified visits that had been circulating through the neighbourhood by word of the mouth for the better part of a year. The regional newspapers picked up fragments of the story. Headlines appeared, warnings to parents, calls for vigilance, vague references to impersonation. The phrase phantom social worker began to circulate in tabloid coverage, initially used almost humorously in the manner of the era's appetite for strange human interest peculiarities, but gradually acquiring a darker undertone as the volume of reports made humour feel less appropriate. By the late 1980s, the phrase had become established enough that people encountering a suspicious doorstep visit knew exactly what to call it. The national response from authorities, when it finally came, was measured and dismissive in equal proportion. Local councils released statements confirming that no organised impersonation scheme had been identified. Police spokespeople offered the same cluster of explanations that would be repeated, with minor variations for years, that many of the reports likely involved genuine social workers whose visits had been misunderstood or misremembered. That rumour and community anxiety could cause people to interpret routine encounters through a distorted lens. That some reports might be the result of inter-neighbour gossip, transforming ambiguous incidents into something more sinister in the retelling. The official narrative was, essentially, that frightened people were seeing threats where none existed. And perhaps that is the simplest explanation. Fear is contagious. The 1980s were a decade in which British public discourse about child welfare had become intensely, almost feverishly heightened. Several high-profile cases of institutional abuse, cases in which the welfare system itself had failed children catastrophically, were working their way into public consciousness with the slow, grinding force of an emerging scandal. The Cleveland child abuse controversy of 1987, in which hundreds of children were removed from their families on the basis of disputed medical diagnoses, had torn apart communities and made the relationship between ordinary families and social services a live, contested, deeply anxiety-laden thing. In this atmosphere, the idea of a threatening figure operating under the cover of social services authority was not a paranoid fantasy. It was an entirely coherent expression of existing social terror. But then there are the details that complicate this comfortable explanation. Then there are the things that a journalist named Daniel Harper, working on a retrospective investigation into historical British child welfare controversies, some 2 decades after the peak of the phantom social worker reports, found himself unable to reconcile with the simple story of mass misperception. Harper came to the case sideways, as investigators so often do. He was not looking for the phantom social worker. He was researching the broader landscape of British child protection policy during the 1980s, a legitimate, serious, well-funded academic-adjacent project that required him to spend considerable time in local newspaper archives and records offices. And it was in those archives that he kept finding her. Brief items, clipped from regional papers, a notice here, a warning there, a short report of a complaint lodged and dismissed. The cumulative volume of these references was greater than he had expected. It was, he later wrote, like discovering that every local paper in Britain had reported a different corner of the same painting. A painting that, when the corners were assembled together, showed something no one had meant to show. What Harper found as he began the painstaking work of cross-referencing accounts across regions and decades was that the behavioural pattern attributed to the phantom social worker was not merely consistent, it was, in his words, almost algorithmically precise. The professional appearance, the welfare concern framing, the request to see children alone, the immediate, departure when challenged. Across dozens of separate reports from North London to West Yorkshire to the East Midlands, these 4 elements appeared together like a signature. Not similar, identical. And this, Harper argued, was the thing that made the mass misperception explanation begin to strain. Rumours spread and mutate. This is their nature. The game of telephone, the childhood experiment in which a message passed through many mouths arrives at the end transformed almost beyond recognition, illustrates a fundamental truth about the way human memory and communication work. If the phantom social worker was nothing more than a collective hallucination generated by community anxiety, you would expect the accounts to show exactly this kind of drift. You would expect some reports to describe a man, others a woman, some to mention a clipboard, others nothing, some to describe the stranger asking to be left alone with children, others to describe something else entirely. You would expect the noise that always attends the amplification of rumour. And yet the signal, across all these reports, was strikingly clean. Harper began requesting access to the original police incident reports, not the summaries that had appeared in newspapers, but the primary documents themselves, the handwritten contemporaneous records that constables had filed when parents came to stations to report their encounters. And this is where the investigation encountered its first serious obstruction. Many of the reports referenced in newspaper articles from the period, reports that had been publicly acknowledged, that had been cited in council statements, that had formed the evidential basis for the official dismissals, were no longer in the archives, not restricted, not redacted, gone. The explanations offered by the relevant police departments were consistent and individually entirely plausible. Records from the 1980s, they explained, had been subject to a series of database migrations and digitization programs across the 1990s and early 2000s. During these migrations, pre-digital records that had been assessed as having no ongoing investigative relevance, which would include closed, unresolved complaint files of exactly this kind, had been subject to routine destruction in accordance with standard records retention schedules. The loss of the specific documents Harper was seeking was entirely consistent with normal administrative practice. There was nothing suspicious about it. It was, the departments emphasised, completely standard. Harper did not find this entirely satisfying for one reason. The paper indexes, the physical ledgers that had been maintained in police stations before computerisation, the handwritten logs that listed every report received and every file created, still existed in some archives, and in those indexes the entries for the missing reports were present. The reports had existed, their reference numbers were there, the dates were there, the initiating officers' names were there, and in several cases there were brief annotations in the index margins, the kind of informal notes that clerical staff sometimes added to help them navigate the filing system, that suggested the reports had been cross-referenced with something. With what, the indexes did not say. The cross-reference codes pointed to file categories that Harper could not identify within the surviving archive system. It is important to be precise about what this does and does not mean. The existence of missing files and unidentified cross-references does not, in itself, prove anything. Administrative chaos is the normal condition of large bureaucratic systems. Files go missing for entirely mundane reasons. Cross-reference codes become orphaned and unreadable when the systems that generated them are retired. None of this required a conspiratorial explanation. Harper was clear about this in his own writing. He was not, he insisted, claiming that the missing files had been deliberately destroyed. He was noting that their absence made it impossible to determine whether the official explanation, mass misperception, was as well supported by the primary evidence as authorities had always suggested. But then there was the interview that Harper conducted with a retired social services employee, a woman who had worked for a London Borough Council throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, and who agreed to speak with Harper only on condition of anonymity, that shifted the texture of the investigation in a way that was difficult to entirely explain away. She had spent her career in the frontline welfare system. She knew the protocols, the paperwork, the professional culture of the period intimately, and she told Harper something that he had not expected. The rumours about impersonation had circulated within social services departments themselves, not loudly, not officially, not in any form that was ever committed to writing, but they had been there. Staff had known. There had been conversations, informal and cautious, about a pattern of doorstep incidents that bore no relation to any authorised visits, and at some point, she could not say precisely when or under what authority, a quiet instruction had been issued to frontline staff. Parents, when they sought advice from social services offices about suspicious doorstep callers, were to be advised to always ask for identification. Staff were to be reminded that no authorised social worker would ever insist on speaking with a child without a parent or guardian present. These were the standard protocols, the woman explained, the protocols that should always have been followed. But the specific timing and framing of the reminder, the fact that it was issued at all as a discrete instruction rather than a simple rehearsal of existing policy, told her that someone, somewhere, had decided the pattern was real enough to require a response. She had asked once what the impersonation incidents were about. She had asked a senior colleague who seemed better informed than most. The answer she received was short and discouraging. She was told that the matter was being handled at a level above the operational. She was told not to raise it in written correspondence. She was told that the last thing anyone needed was a public panic about the safety of children in their own homes. And she had, as one did in those years within large institutional systems that carried the weight of professional consequence, let the matter drop. The intelligence angle, the suggestion that the phantom social worker incidents might have been connected to something beyond ordinary criminal impersonation, belongs primarily to the more speculative reaches of the conspiracy theory literature that has grown up around the case. It would be irresponsible to present these theories as established fact, and Harper himself was careful not to do so. But they deserve to be examined because they illuminate the broader historical context in which these events occurred, and because the circumstantial threads, though none of them constitute proof, are individually intriguing. The 1980s were not only a period of heightened anxiety about child welfare, they were also the tail end of the Cold War, a period in which the British security services were deeply enmeshed in a wide range of domestic surveillance and social research programs, some of which remained entirely classified until decades later, and some of which, when they did eventually surface, proved to be considerably more intrusive and ethically questionable than the public had been led to believe. The Spycatcher affair, which broke in 1987, revealed the existence of MI5 domestic operations that had been conducted without parliamentary oversight or public knowledge. The extent of covert social research conducted under the banner of national security during this period, research into political affiliation, community organisation, family structure, and the socialisation of children, has never been fully disclosed. Several researchers working on the margins of the Phantom Social Worker case have pointed to a specific strand of Cold War social research that was conducted in Britain and in the United States during the 1960s, 70s and early 80s, research into the structure and vulnerability of family units under conditions of stress, social disruption and authority challenge. The hypothesis, floated carefully, never definitively advanced, is that the phantom social worker visits may have been a form of field research, unauthorised, compartmentalised, conducted by operatives or contractors working under some form of institutional cover, designed to study how families responded to authority-based doorstep, intrusion. What happened when a figure of official authority knocked on a door and made a specific, deeply uncomfortable request? What percentage of families complied? What variables, social class, neighbourhood type, previous welfare system contact, predicted compliance or refusal? How did families process and report the encounter afterward? No documentation supporting this hypothesis has ever been produced. No whistleblower has come forward with specific institutional knowledge. The government has never acknowledged any programme of this description. It belongs firmly and unambiguously in the realm of conjecture. Compelling conjecture, perhaps, in light of what we now know about the scope of Cold War domestic surveillance programs on both sides of the Atlantic, but conjecture nonetheless. Harper himself described the intelligence angle as a theoretical framework that happened to fit the available evidence rather uncomfortably well, while acknowledging that fitting the evidence and being supported by the evidence were two fundamentally different things. There is a third possibility that sits between the two main competing explanations, between mass misperception and coordinated impersonation, and it is, in some ways, the most disturbing of all. It is the possibility that the phantom social worker was real, singular, and operating entirely alone. A single individual, deeply familiar with the procedures and presentation of social services, travelling methodically across the country, gaining access to homes and children for reasons that were never identified and never interrupted. The behavioural consistency that Harper found so striking would, under this hypothesis, be not the signature of institutional organisation but the signature of a single, disciplined, purposeful person. One woman, one clipboard, one practised line of inquiry, hundreds of families, decades of access, and yet no one was ever arrested. No suspect was ever identified. No name was ever attached to the description. The woman who knocked on all those doors, if she was real, if she was one woman, if she was doing what the most alarming reading of the evidence suggests she might have been doing, walked away from every single encounter without consequence. She was never caught in the act, never photographed, never detained, never explained. The people who opened their doors to her are older now. Some are gone. The children she asked to speak with alone are adults. Adults who in most cases probably never knew what their parents reported, never knew what questions had been asked in the local police station afterward, never knew that their particular family had been one entry in a pattern that stretched from London to the north of England and back again. What those children experienced, if they experienced anything, is unknown. What happened in the rooms that their parents stepped out of, In the cases where parents did step out, this too is unknown. This is perhaps the most unbearable part of the entire case, not the conspiracy, not the missing files, not the retired employee's careful, frightened confidence. The unbearable part is the simple and total absence of answers. Harper published his investigation as a long-form piece in a small but respected current affairs journal. The response was significant enough to generate coverage in several national newspapers, a brief flurry of online discussion, and a handful of additional witness accounts from people who'd been waiting, apparently, for someone to take the subject seriously enough to write about it properly. Several of these additional accounts came from the children, now adults, who had been the ostensible subjects of the visits. Most of them had been too young at the time to have clear memories, but a few had been old enough to remember something. They remembered a woman. They remembered being asked about their home life, their school, their friends. They remembered that their parents had seemed frightened after the woman left, though the children had not understood why at the time. They remembered that the subject had never been explained to them, that it had become one of those family episodes that existed as a kind of silent, pressurized absence in household memory, a thing that happened and was never discussed. The official position on the phantom social worker case, to the extent that any official position exists, remains what it has always been: an unexplained social panic, probably the product of rumour amplified by community anxiety, in a period when anxiety about child welfare and social services authority was already running high. The missing records are an administrative artifact. The behavioural consistency of witness accounts reflects the distorting power of collective narrative. There is nothing to investigate because there was never anything to find. For most mainstream historians of late 20th century British social policy, this explanation is adequate. The 1980s produced several moral panics of considerable intensity. Panics about video nasties, about satanic ritual abuse, about a dozen other threats that turned out, on careful examination, to be products of social fear rather than documented reality. The phantom social worker fits this context comfortably enough. She belongs, in the orthodox reading, on the shelf alongside other figures from the decade's collective nightmares. Not real, but expressive. Not a threat, but a symbol of the fear that threat was possible. And yet there are those reports from families in different cities who had never heard of each other, describing the same 4 behavioural elements in the same sequence. There is the retired social services worker describing internal protocols issued in response to something real enough to require a response. There are the missing files, and the cross-references that lead nowhere, and the paper index, entries that record a thing that can no longer be read. There is the cold, precise consistency of a pattern that should, if it were nothing but rumour, have frayed at the edges long ago. The phantom social worker has never been identified. No photograph of the woman, or women, or operative, or whoever she was, has ever been produced. No arrest, no trial, no official inquiry, no formal acknowledgement that the pattern was real enough to merit serious investigation. She knocked on doors. She asked to see children alone. She left when challenged. She was reported in newspapers across the country and discussed in anxious community bulletins and quietly referenced in internal social services memos that no longer exist. And then she disappeared into the same silence that covers everything in this case. The silence of unanswered questions, of administrative oversight, of a generation that grew up and moved on and tried not to think too hard about what the knock at the door might have meant. Some cases give us answers. Some cases give us trials and verdicts and the grim satisfaction of closure. This is not one of those cases. The phantom social worker belongs to a different category entirely. The category of things that happened clearly enough to leave a record, but not clearly enough to leave an explanation. She is there in the archives, or rather she is there in the absence the archives have left where she should be. She is there in the memories of parents who still, decades later, remember the cold feeling that moved through them when they asked to see identification, and watch the woman's face shift into the practiced blankness of someone preparing to leave. How many families let her in? How many parents stepped out of the room? How many children sat alone with a woman whose name and purpose no one has ever been able to confirm? We do not know. We may never know. That is the case as it stands. That is the case as it has always stood and as it may stand forever. A knock at the door, a woman with a clipboard, a request that should have been refused, and a silence afterward that no official explanation has ever fully filled. To truly understand the weight of what the phantom social worker represents, you have to spend some time inside the particular atmosphere of 1980s Britain. Not just the headlines and the political drama, but the texture of everyday life, the way ordinary families experienced the world that the welfare state had built around them, and, increasingly, felt the chill of its less comforting aspects. The decade that began with widespread unemployment and the deep economic restructuring of deindustrialisation was also the decade in which the British state's relationship with the family was being fundamentally renegotiated. Social services departments had been expanded, empowered, and tasked with levels of intervention in family life that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Children Act of 1989, which would become the foundational piece of child welfare legislation for the decades that followed, was itself the product of years of controversy, failed policy, and the public reckoning with cases in which children had died despite being known to welfare services. These were cases that shaped the decade's understanding of what it meant to be a parent and what it meant to be watched by the state. The deaths of Jasmine Beckford in 1984 and Kimberly Carlisle in 1986, both children killed by abusive caregivers despite repeated contact with social workers, generated enormous public and media pressure on welfare departments to intervene more aggressively, more decisively and earlier. The result, in some areas, was exactly the kind of expanded and assertive social work practice that made the idea of an unannounced doorstep visit entirely believable to any parent who answered the door. Social workers were everywhere during this decade. They were in the schools, they were in the hospitals, they were on the doorsteps of families in every kind of neighbourhood. The professional infrastructure of child protection had become so vast and its reach so normalised that a stranger claiming to represent it was almost impossible to challenge without feeling, however irrationally, that the challenge itself might be used against you. And this is the climate into which the phantom social worker, whoever she was, stepped. She did not create the conditions for her own operation. Those conditions had been created by decades of policy development, by genuine tragedies, by the legitimate and necessary expansion of child welfare infrastructure. She simply, if she existed as an intentional actor rather than a collective projection, understood that the conditions were right, that the uniform of authority was more powerful in that decade than at perhaps any point since, that the question of whether you should let a stranger into your home to speak with your child alone was not, in the Britain of the 1980s, a question with an obvious answer. The terror of being seen to fail your children was, for many families, larger than the terror of someone who might wish them harm. The geography of the reports tells its own story. When Harper mapped the documented incidents, those he could verify through newspaper records and the surviving fragments of official documentation, a pattern emerged that he found significant. The incidents were not random. They were clustered in specific types of neighbourhoods, areas with high concentrations of young families, areas with above-average rates of social services contact, areas where community trust in authority institutions had been disrupted by economic hardship or previous controversies. These were not wealthy neighbourhoods, by and large. They were places where people had less institutional power, where challenging an official figure at the door required more courage and carried greater perceived risk, where the social infrastructure of the welfare state was both more visible and more ambivalent in its relationship with the community it ostensibly served. This geographic clustering is interesting for several reasons. If the phantom social worker was a product of rumour and collective anxiety, you would not necessarily expect the rumours to concentrate in these specific types of locations, rather than spreading more evenly across the social geography of the regions where they were reported. Moral panics tend to travel along social networks, and social networks cross economic and class boundaries more fluidly than a simple rumour cluster map would predict. But if the phantom social worker was a real actor, or a real organisation, the geographic concentration makes a certain cold sense. These were the neighbourhoods where entry was easiest, where refusal was hardest. where the most useful behavioural data, if behavioural data was what was being gathered, could be obtained with the least resistance. There were also, Harper noted with care, several incidents that stood slightly apart from the main pattern. Incidents that suggested, if taken seriously, that the operation had not always gone according to plan. In at least 3 documented cases, the visiting woman had been pursued. Not far. In one case, a parent had followed her to the end of the street before losing sight of her. In another, a neighbour had attempted to take note of a car that may have been associated with the visit, but pursued nonetheless. In none of these cases did the pursuit yield anything useful. No car registration was fully recorded. No clear direction of departure was established. The woman, in each case, simply ceased to be visible. She had apparently anticipated pursuit as part of the operational pattern she needed to manage. This detail, the suggestion of practiced evasion, is one that sits uncomfortably with the urban legend explanation. Rumours do not practice evasion. Misidentified genuine social workers do not vanish down residential streets when followed. The detail implies intentionality, implies preparation, implies an awareness that what was being done required the ability to disappear quickly and without trace, and it implies, above all, that whoever was doing this had done it enough times to know that sometimes people followed, and had developed a reliable response to that contingency. The children, in almost all documented cases, were not harmed in any physically verifiable way. This is important to state clearly. The phantom social worker was not, so far as the evidence records, a case of abduction or assault. The children who were visited remained in their homes, remained with their families, and in the cases where a parent stepped out of the room, returned to their parent within minutes. When the woman left, she left alone. Whatever her purpose, whatever the nature of her interest in these families and their children, she did not take anything tangible. She arrived, she asked, she spoke, she left. What was transacted in those rooms? What information passed from child to stranger? What was observed? What was recorded in whatever method she had available? Is entirely unknown. Some of the adults who came forward in response to Harper's published investigation, the ones who'd been children during the visits, reported that they had been asked about specific, seemingly innocuous subjects. One remembered being asked about her parents' work schedules. Another remembered questions about who picked him up from school and whether he spent time at neighbours' houses. A third, a woman who had been perhaps 7 or 8 at the time and whose memory was accordingly fragmentary, had a clear recollection of being asked whether her parents had ever spoken to her about the government, about politics, about the news. These details, individually, might mean nothing. Children's memories are unreliable, particularly across a gap of decades. The questions, if accurately remembered, could have any number of explanations ranging from the sinister to the entirely prosaic. But taken together, with the geographic clustering, with the behavioural precision, with the missing files and the retired employee's cautious disclosure and the cross-references that led nowhere, they contribute to an evidential texture that Harper described as deeply, persistently unsatisfying to anyone who wanted either the comfort of a definitive explanation or the clean horror of a confirmed conspiracy. The case refuses both. It occupies the space between, the space where the most disturbing things tend to live, not quite confirmed, not quite dismissed, present enough to demand attention, and absent enough to deny resolution. The question of motive, if the visits were real and intentional, is the one that generates the widest range of speculation. For the more straightforward criminal impersonation hypothesis, the motive is presumably predatory access to children, the most horrifying reading, and one that the lack of documented harm makes difficult to sustain without further evidence, but one that investigators of child exploitation cases are professionally obligated never to dismiss simply because evidence of physical harm is absent. The absence of documented harm is not the same as the certainty that no harm occurred. The recording and reporting of harm against children in the 1980s was imperfect at best. For the social research hypothesis, the motive is data collection. Information about family structures, parental responses to authority, the vulnerability of households to institutional intrusion. This is disturbing in a different register. Not the horror of individual predation, but the horror of systemic disregard for privacy and consent, of families treated as experimental subjects rather than as people. This kind of motive has precedent in the documented history of Cold War social research programs. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment in America, the various mind control research programs that operated under CIA and MK-Ultra funding, the domestic surveillance programs that Britain's own security services conducted against trade unionists, political activists, and community organisers throughout the same decades. These programs establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that governments and their intelligence apparatus have been willing, historically, to conduct research and operations involving ordinary citizens without their knowledge or consent. The only question, in applying this precedent to the phantom social worker case, is whether the scale of the apparent operation fits the institutional capacity likely to be involved. And here the skeptics have their strongest argument. The phantom social worker incidents, whatever their true nature, were distributed across a significant geographic area over a significant period of time. An institutional research program capable of sustaining that kind of operation would have required coordination, personnel, cover stories, funding, and management. It would have left traces in budget lines and personnel records and departmental communications. No such traces have been found. The absence of supporting documentation is, in this case, an argument against the institutional hypothesis, rather than simply an artifact of incomplete archives, because institutional programs of this scale do generate paper, and that paper, even when classified, tends to survive somewhere. Unless, of course, it does not. Unless the program was compartmentalized to a degree that placed its documentation entirely outside normal records management systems. Unless the people who ran it understood, from the beginning, that it was the kind of thing that could not be permitted to leave a conventional institutional footprint, this is not an impossible scenario. It is, in fact, the scenario that characterizes several of the most sensitive covert programs that have come to light since the Cold War ended. Programs run off the books, funded through channels that did not appear in standard budget documentation, managed by people who understood that their activities were not merely classified but deniable. The absence of evidence in these cases is precisely what was intended. Harper spent several years after his initial publication attempting to take the investigation further. He submitted Freedom of Information requests to multiple government departments and police forces. The responses he received were, with a few exceptions, polite confirmations that no relevant records could be identified. He interviewed former social services managers, retired police officers, community workers who had been active during the period in question. Most had nothing to add. A few confirmed the general atmosphere of the era without providing anything specific. And then, 2 years after his initial piece was published, he received a letter. The letter was handwritten, posted from a city Harper declined to identify, and signed with a name he declined to reproduce. The writer claimed to have worked, in the early 1980s, for a private research consultancy that contracted with government bodies on social research projects. The writer described, in general terms, a project that had involved doorstep fieldwork in residential neighbourhoods, fieldwork that used cover identities rather than the consultancy's actual institutional identity, on the grounds that undisclosed observation produced more reliable behavioural data than disclosed observation. The writer did not name the government body that had commissioned the research, did not provide any documentation, and explicitly stated that they were writing because they were approaching the end of their life and found the secrecy of the matter increasingly difficult to justify in good conscience. Harper could not verify the letter's authenticity. He never received a follow-up communication. He published a reference to it, with careful qualifications about its unverifiable status, and noted that it was consistent with the research hypothesis without constituting evidence for it. The letter may have been genuine. It may have been the work of someone who had read the original article and wished, for their own reasons, to add a layer of apparent confirmation to an appealing theory. It may have been the product of someone's wish to be part of a story they found compelling. Harper's conclusion was that the letter was interesting, and that interesting was the most he could responsibly say about it. The phantom social worker case has found a second life in the digital age, in the way that all unresolved historical mysteries tend to. Online communities dedicated to unexplained British history and cold cases have accumulated threads hundreds of posts long in which researchers share newspaper clippings, regional variations in the witness accounts, theories about the Cold War research angle, and occasional contributions from people claiming personal knowledge. The quality of these contributions varies enormously. Some are rigorous and evidentially careful. Others are fanciful extensions of the conspiracy hypothesis into territory that the actual evidence cannot support. The difficulty, as always with cases of this kind, is that the genuine enigma provides a foundation onto which any number of speculative structures can be built, and the more compelling the foundation, the harder it becomes to distinguish the structure that the evidence actually supports from the structures that simply feel right. What is not in dispute among serious researchers is that something happened. The reports are too numerous, too geographically widespread, and too behaviourally consistent to be entirely explained away. Something generated all of those accounts in all of those newspapers and all of those police logs and all of those community newsletters. Whether that something was a single individual, a coordinated group, an institutional programme, or a cultural panic that somehow managed to produce perfectly consistent false memories across dozens of unconnected families in multiple regions. Something was there. Something knocked on those doors. Something made those parents afraid in a very specific way, afraid enough to report it, afraid enough to warn their neighbours, afraid enough that decades later the people involved still remember it as one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of their lives. The children of that era are the grandparents and parents of this one. The neighbourhoods where the visits were concentrated have changed, some of them beyond recognition, gentrified, redeveloped, dispersed. The social services departments that may or may not have issued quiet internal warnings no longer exist in their original forms. They have been restructured, renamed, merged, and reorganised through 30 years of successive government reforms. The police forces that received the original reports and filed them, and in some cases lost them, have undergone similar transformations. The institutional landscape that the phantom social worker operated within, that gave her, or whoever she was, the cover that made her activities possible, is in many ways unrecognisable from what it was. But the question remains. It has always remained, and it shows no sign of resolving itself into an answer simply because time has passed and people have moved on. It is the kind of question that survives its own era, that outlasts the particular social context that generated it, because at its core it is not really about 1980s Britain at all. It is about something more fundamental and more enduring. It is about the moment when a figure of authority stands on your doorstep and makes a request that troubles you, and you have to decide, in the few seconds available before the silence becomes its own answer, whether to comply or to resist, whether the authority is real, whether the request is legitimate, whether the consequences of refusal are worse than the consequences of compliance, whether the thing that feels wrong is an accurate perception of reality or a product of your own fear. The case also raises a question that is rarely asked directly, but that sits underneath all of the investigation and all of the theorising like a foundation stone. What would it take, as a society, to take this kind of report seriously? Not to dismiss it as rumour, not to explain it away with institutional convenience, but to genuinely investigate it with the seriousness it might deserve. The answer, unfortunately, is that it would take exactly the kind of institutional will and independent oversight capacity that the British government of the 1980s was not equipped to provide, and that, some would argue, the British government of any era has rarely been motivated to apply to questions about its own conduct. The complaints came from ordinary families. The reports were filed by local constables. The pattern crossed jurisdictions in ways that no single investigating body felt responsible for assembling. And in the absence of a single galvanising incident, a caught suspect, a confirmed crime, a clear and visible victim, the bureaucratic machinery simply did not engage. It ground forward on its own purposes and left the question unanswered because unanswered questions, in the institutional calculus of large democratic governments, cost less than answered ones. These are not questions that the 1980s invented. They are questions that every generation faces in its own way, with its own particular version of the figure at the door. What the phantom social worker did, whether she was real or imagined, singular or organised, criminal or institutional, was to make those questions vivid and immediate in a way that most people prefer not to think about. She put a face and a clipboard and a professional smile on the thing that most of us try to believe we would always recognise and always resist. And then she walked away, leaving nothing behind her but the memory of a feeling and a silence where an explanation should have been. That is the phantom social worker, wherever you are listening from tonight, and I genuinely want to know, so please do leave your city and time zone in the comments below. I hope you're somewhere safe, somewhere warm, with the doors locked and the light on. If this story has found a corner of your mind that will not let it go, share it with someone tomorrow, not to frighten them, but because the best thing that can happen to an unresolved case is that more people know about it, more people asking questions, more people checking their own local archives, more people refusing to accept that administrative convenience is the same thing as the truth. If you are a long-time listener who has never left a comment, tonight is the night. Tell us where you are. Tell us what you think happened. Tell us if this story reminded you of something you heard as a child, something your parents mentioned, something a neighbour once said at the garden fence about a strange woman with a clipboard who came around one Tuesday afternoon and left in a hurry when someone asked to see her credentials. The archive is never truly closed. Someone out there knows something. Sleep Theories will be back very soon. Thank you for being here, and for those of you listening on Spotify, a review means everything. It is how new listeners find their way to us in the dark. Until next time, take care of yourselves and sleep well. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to give a quick shout out to Ilwyn Eventually for suggesting this story idea. If you have ideas for future Sleep Theories episodes, conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, strange phenomena you think deserve a deeper look, drop them in the comments below. Some of the best stories we've covered came directly from you, and we really try and read every single suggestion. Now, let's begin. There are places on Earth that feel wrong, not dangerous, not hostile, just wrong. Devil's Tower is one of them. Rising 867 feet above the Wyoming grasslands, it dominates the landscape like a broken tooth jutting from the Earth's jaw. The Lakota people called it Matotipila, Bear Lodge. Geologists call it an igneous intrusion. Tourists call it stunning. But stand at its base as the sun sets and the temperature drops, and you'll feel something else entirely. You'll feel watched. The tower doesn't look like a mountain. Mountains have slopes, curves, the organic chaos of tectonic violence. Devil's Tower looks carved, deliberate. Its hexagonal columns rise in perfect vertical symmetry, too precise to feel accidental, too uniform to feel natural. It looks like architecture. More specifically, it looks like a stump. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally. as though some impossibly massive tree was severed at ground level, its wood petrified into stone over millennia, its roots still buried somewhere beneath the Wyoming soil. Most people dismiss this idea immediately. It's pseudoscience, geological fantasy, the fever dream of conspiracy theorists who see patterns where none exist. But here's the thing about Devil's Tower that nobody mentions in the visitor brochures. The locals don't just fear the height, they fear what happens there after dark. Park rangers enforce strict closure policies after sunset. Official explanation: safety concerns, wildlife protection, sacred site preservation. Reasonable enough, but ask anyone who's lived in the shadow of that tower for more than a decade, and they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you about the lights, the chanting, the convoys of black vehicles that arrive without announcement and leave without trace. They'll tell you about the nights when the tower hums. Some say it's a monument of stone, a geological curiosity, nothing more. Others say it's the stump of something that once touched the sky. And a very small number of people with security clearances, offshore accounts and names you'd recognise from television, say it's still alive, still growing, still waiting. This is the story of what happens when someone watches back. Chapter 1. The Man Who Worked the Night Roads. Michael Carver had lived in northeastern Wyoming his entire life. 52 years of wide skies, brutal winters, and the kind of silence that makes city people uncomfortable. He'd been born in Gillette, raised in Moorcroft, and spent the last 28 years working for the National Park Service maintaining the infrastructure roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. Night shifts mostly. He preferred them. Fewer tourists, fewer questions. Just him, his truck, the radio crackling with weather reports, and the tower standing sentinel against the stars. Michael knew every curve of State Highway 110, every pothole on the access roads, every blind turn where deer like to cross. He could drive the perimeter with his eyes closed, and sometimes on the longest nights he practically did. He'd heard all the stories, the Lakota legend of the bear clawing at the stone, leaving vertical grooves as 7 sisters escaped to the sky. The Close Encounters pilgrims who still showed up with synthesizers, trying to recreate the 5-tone sequence from the Spielberg film. The flat earthers who insisted the tower was proof of a megatree forest that once covered the planet. Michael had never believed any of it. Not the mystical interpretations, not the alien theories, not the giant tree hypothesis. He was a practical man. He fixed roads. He cleared rockfall. He filed reports in triplicate and went home to a 1-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that got 4 channels on a good day. Devil's Tower was just a rock, an impressive rock, a beautiful rock, but still just a rock. That certainty lasted until October 17th, the night everything changed. Chapter 2. The Unscheduled Closure. It started with an email. Michael was finishing his second cup of coffee when the notification buzzed on his phone. 7:45 p.m, 15 minutes before his shift began. The subject line read, Immediate, Road Closure Directive, DTM-0-9-13. He opened it. Effective 1800 hours, October 17th. All access roads to Devil's Tower National Monument are closed for emergency geological surveying. Duration, 12 hours. All non-essential personnel are to vacate the area. Park enforcement will verify compliance. No exceptions. It was signed by someone Michael didn't recognise. No name, just a title. Regional Infrastructure Coordinator, Emergency Operations. Michael frowned. He'd been doing this job for nearly 3 decades. He knew every survey team, every seasonal closure, every maintenance window scheduled months in advance. Geological surveying didn't happen overnight. It required permits, equipment manifests, environmental impact assessments. And it definitely didn't happen in October. Survey teams worked in spring and summer when the ground was stable and the weather predictable. Fall in Wyoming was unpredictable. Early snow, freezing rain, winds that could knock a vehicle off the road. Michael checked the park's internal scheduling system. No survey teams logged, no equipment rentals approved, no geological consultants contracted. He called his supervisor. Voicemail. He called the park ranger station. Voicemail. He called the regional office in Denver. The line rang 8 times before a woman answered, sounding harried. "This is Carver. Night maintenance at Devil's Tower. I got a closure notice for tonight, but there's nothing in the system. Can you—" "The closure is authorized," she interrupted. "Follow the directive." "Who authorized it?" "I don't have that information." "What survey team is—" "I don't have that information either. The directive is valid. Comply or file an incident report." She hung up. Michael sat in his truck, engine idling, staring at the email on his phone. Something was wrong. In 28 years, he'd never seen a closure order issued with 0 notice, 0 explanation, and 0 paper trail. The Park Service was a bureaucracy. Everything had a paper trail. Everything except this. He should have driven home. He should have cracked open a beer, watched television, let someone else worry about mysterious closure orders. But Michael Carver had spent his entire life in the shadow of Devil's Tower, and he'd never, not once, felt curious about what happened there after dark. Until now. He put the truck in gear and headed toward the outer perimeter. Chapter 3. The Ring of 12. Michael parked on a ridge 3 miles northwest of the tower. It was a maintenance access point, technically within the monument's boundaries, but far enough from the main roads that nobody ever bothered with it. He'd used it 100 times to check remote culverts and drainage systems. From here you could see the tower's western face silhouetted against the night sky like a broken pillar holding up the stars. He killed the engine and waited. 9:37 p.m. The monument grounds were completely dark. No visitor centre lights, no parking lot floods, no security perimeter illumination, just darkness. And then light, not sudden, not bright, just there. Michael grabbed his binoculars. 12 lights, evenly spaced, arranged in a perfect circle around the tower's base. Not headlights, too stationary, not flashlights, too steady. They looked like torches. No, not torches. The light was too white, too clean. LED floods, maybe, or halogen lamps on portable stands. But why 12? Why arranged in perfect geometric precision? Michael counted again. 12. Exactly 12. He checked his watch. 9:41 p.m. He scanned the access roads with his binoculars. No vehicles, no movement. Where had the lights come from? He swept back to the tower. The lights remained, perfectly still, perfectly spaced. And then he saw the first vehicle. Chapter 4. The arrival. It came from the south, headlights off, moving slowly along the main access road. A black SUV. Cadillac Escalade, maybe. Hard to tell in the darkness. It stopped near the base of the tower just outside the ring of lights. Doors opened. 4 figures emerged dressed in dark clothing. They moved with the precise coordination of security personnel scanning the perimeter, checking sight lines, establishing positions. Then the second vehicle arrived. Another black SUV, same make, same slow approach. Then a third, fourth, fifth. Michael counted 11 vehicles in total, all identical, all unmarked, all arriving within 20 minutes. No park permits had been filed. No special event licenses issued. No documentation whatsoever. The figures from the vehicles began unloading equipment. Not geological surveying tools, not scientific instruments, portable generators, audio equipment. What looked like ceremonial stands or altars. Michael's hands were shaking as he adjusted the binoculars. The passengers began emerging from the later vehicles, and that's when he started recognizing faces. The first was a woman he'd seen on television 100 times, a tech CEO whose company had recently absorbed 3 competitors and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. She stepped out of the third SUV wearing a long dark coat, her face illuminated briefly by interior lights. The second was a senator. Michael couldn't remember which state, but he recognized the silver hair, the sharp features, the way cameras loved that face during election cycles. The third was an actor, Academy Award winner, known for playing heroes in action films and philanthropists in prestige dramas. The fourth was a media mogul whose news network shaped global narratives. The fifth was a tech entrepreneur whose social media platform had replaced town squares and public discourse. One by one they emerged. Billionaires, politicians, cultural icons, people whose names appeared in Forbes lists and Time magazine covers. People who supposedly had nothing in common except wealth and influence, and yet here they were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, walking toward Devil's Tower like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Michael felt his pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't a survey team. This was something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Path of Torches. The security. Personnel had been busy. From his vantage point, Michael could see a temporary pathway leading from the parking area toward the base of the tower. It was lined with torches, real flames this time, not electric lights, casting flickering orange light across the pale stone. The path wound through the boulder field, carefully navigating the uneven terrain, ending at a flat area directly beneath the tower's western face. The attendees began walking, slowly, silently. Michael counted 23 people in total. Some he recognised, most he didn't, but all of them moved with the same deliberate purpose, the same ritualistic precision. And then he noticed what they were wearing. Over their expensive coats and tailored suits, they donned ceremonial robes, dark fabric, floor-length, hooded. As they walked, the robes caught the torchlight, revealing embroidered symbols, inverted pentagrams, tree sigils, massive trunks with roots spreading like veins, runic shapes Michael didn't recognise, but which felt ancient, pre-Christian, older than language itself. One woman, a banking executive whose face Michael had seen in financial news segments, carried a portable altar. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, carved from dark wood and covered in more symbols. A man, possibly a diplomat based on his bearing, carried what looked like a ceremonial staff. It was wrapped in leather and topped with something that caught the firelight wrong, like polished obsidian or volcanic glass. They weren't tourists. They weren't scientists. They were worshippers, and Devil's Tower wasn't a monument. It was their temple. Michael's mind raced back to the stories he'd dismissed for decades, the giant tree theory. It had always seemed absurd. The idea that Devil's Tower wasn't a volcanic intrusion but a petrified stump from an ancient megaforest. That Earth had once been covered in trees so massive they made modern redwoods look like saplings. That some prehistoric cataclysm had felled them, all, leaving only scattered stumps like Devil's Tower, Shiprock in New Mexico, and similar formations worldwide. Pseudoscience, geology deniers, conspiracy nonsense. But watching these people approach the tower in ritual formation, watching them treat it like something sacred, something alive, what if they knew something the rest of the world didn't? What if Devil's Tower wasn't dead stone? What if it was dormant? Chapter 6. The Frequency of Silence. The chanting began at 10:17 p.m. Michael heard it before he saw the source, a low resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his truck, rattling the windows, settling into his chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't singing, it wasn't speaking, it was something between the two, a vocalization that felt older than words, structured yet alien, harmonic yet mechanical. Through the binoculars, he watched the robed figures form a circle around the tower's base. They stood, perfectly still, heads slightly bowed, hands raised to chest height, palms facing inward. The chant continued. No visible conductor, no rhythm section, no leader keeping time, and yet they were perfectly synchronized. The sound had texture, layers. It felt less like music and more like machinery, like the resonance of a massive engine idling deep underground, its vibrations surfacing through stone and soil. Michael had worked around heavy equipment his entire career. He knew the feel of generators, the hum of transformers, the grinding of hydraulic systems. This was different. This felt intentional, designed. And then he noticed the silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant highway noise, usually a constant whisper on Wyoming nights, had vanished. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Michael scanned the area with his binoculars. The grassland surrounding the tower was normally alive with nocturnal activity, deer grazing, coyotes prowling, bats, hunting insects beneath the stars. Nothing moved, not a single animal, not a single bird. Even the insects, the ubiquitous moths and beetles that swarmed around any light source, were gone. The only living things in the entire landscape were the 23 people standing in a circle, chanting in a language Michael didn't recognise, worshipping a tower that shouldn't exist. And then the tower responded. Chapter 7. The Stone That Remembers. It started as a vibration. Michael felt it through the truck's frame, a low-frequency tremor that made the steering wheel buzz beneath his white-knuckled grip. At first, he thought it was an earthquake. Wyoming got them occasionally, minor tremors from the Yellowstone caldera or distant fault line adjustments. But this was different. This was rhythmic, pulsing in time with the chanting. Through the binoculars, he watched the tower itself, the hexagonal columns, those perfect vertical striations that geologists attributed to cooling. Basalt seemed to shimmer in the torchlight, not from heat distortion, not from atmospheric interference. They were pulsing, subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable, as if the stone was breathing. Michael's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Resonance effects from the chanting, acoustic phenomena amplified by the tower's unique structure, infrasound frequencies causing visual distortions. But his instincts, the part of him that had survived 52 Wyoming winters by trusting his gut, knew better. The tower was reacting. He could feel heat now, even from 3 miles away. Not the ambient warmth of bodies and torches, something deeper, something radiating outward from the stone itself, warming the October air, creating convection currents that made the stars ripple overhead. Michael thought about basalt, about igneous rock, about the geological formation story he'd heard 1,000 times. 60 million years ago, magma pushed up through sedimentary layers but never reached the surface. It cooled slowly underground, forming crystalline columns. Over millennia, erosion removed the softer surrounding rock, leaving the harder basalt tower exposed. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Except, what if the tower wasn't basalt? What if it was wood? Petrified over epochs, compressed, mineralized, transformed from organic to mineral while retaining the fundamental structure, the vertical grain, the hexagonal cells, the internal channels that once carried water and nutrients from roots to canopy. What if Devil's Tower was exactly what it looked like? A stump, the severed base of a tree so massive it defied comprehension. And if that were true, if the tower was fossilized wood instead of cooled magma, then the next question became unavoidable. Could petrified wood still conduct energy? Could it still remember being alive? Michael watched the robed figures continue their chant, watched the tower pulse in response, and felt the answer settling into his bones like winter cold. Yes. Chapter 8. The Platform of Rings. At 10:41 p.m. the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the vibration ceased, leaving only the whisper of Michael's own breathing and the tick of cooling metal in the truck's engine. The robed figures remained motionless for exactly 60 seconds. Then they began to move. The security personnel brought forward a circular platform, maybe 20 feet in diameter, constructed from what looked like dark metal or composite material. It took 6 people to carry it, moving with the strained precision of pallbearers. They set it down at the tower's base, directly centered beneath the western face. Michael adjusted his binoculars, increasing magnification despite the growing shake in his hands. The platform's surface was covered in carved symbols, concentric circles like tree rings, but not random, not organic. These were perfect, mathematical, spiraling inward toward a central point with geometric precision that made Michael's eyes hurt to follow. Between the rings, more symbols, runes, glyphs, characters from alphabets Michael didn't recognise. Some looked vaguely Scandinavian, others resembled Sanskrit or ancient Sumerian. A few seemed completely alien, angles that shouldn't fit together, curves that defied Euclidean geometry. The platform wasn't just decorative, it was functional. A map, a key, a diagram of something vast and complex. The robed figures formed a circle around it, leaving the centre empty. Then the altar arrived. Chapter 9. The Obsidian Offering. 8 people carried it. A massive slab of polished obsidian, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, supported by an ornate metal frame. Even from 3 miles away, Michael could see how the volcanic glass caught the torchlight, reflecting it, refracting it, seeming to absorb and emit light simultaneously. They placed it at the platform's centre, directly over the convergence point of all the carved rings. The altar's surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in objects, fragments of fossilised wood, ranging from thumbnail-sized splinters to pieces as large as a human forearm. The wood had the distinctive texture of petrification, mineralised, heavy, transformed from carbon to silica over incomprehensible time. Bone relics, not modern, not recent. These were ancient, yellowed, partially fossilised, worked into shapes that might have been tools or ceremonial objects. Michael couldn't tell from this distance, but something about their arrangement felt deliberate, sacred, metallic artefacts, strange alloys that didn't match any metal Michael recognised. They had a greenish patina, like old copper, but the shapes were wrong. Too angular, too precise, too manufactured. One of the robed figures stepped forward. Michael recognised the bearing, if not the face. Someone used to authority, to command, to being obeyed without question. This person wore a different robe, while the others were plain dark fabric. This one was embroidered with gold thread forming an intricate tree pattern. The tree's trunk was straight and massive. Its roots spread across the robe's hem like underground rivers. Its branches reached toward the shoulders, each one ending in symbols that might have been stars or fruits or watchful eyes. But it was the mask that made Michael's breath catch. The figure wore a ceremonial mask carved from dark wood, depicting a horned entity that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The face was elongated, almost skull-like. The horns curved upward and backward like those of a ram or ancient forest deity. The eyes were hollow sockets, creating the unsettling impression that something behind the mask was looking out. This was the leader, the one who would speak for all of them, the one who would address whatever they believed lived beneath Devil's Tower. The masked figure raised both arms, the chanting resumed, but this time Michael could make out individual words, or what might have been words, fragmented through distortion and distance and his own pounding heartbeat. He pulled out his phone, started recording. The audio quality would be terrible, but maybe, if he survived this, if he didn't disappear like so many conspiracy theorists who got too close to uncomfortable truths, maybe someone could analyse it, translate it, confirm what he was hearing. The chant had structure now, call and response. The masked leader would vocalise a phrase and the circle would echo it back, their voices layered and harmonic. Michael caught fragments. He who was cut shall rise again. The root still drinks. Beneath the earth, blood and bone and breath, to the rooted one. The rooted one, not a god of the sky, not a deity of heaven or light or transcendent salvation, a god of roots, of depth, of things buried and patient and very, very old. Michael's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the binoculars steady. These people, billionaires and politicians and cultural elites, weren't just performing theatre. They weren't playing at mysticism or engaging in rich people eccentricity. They believed. They believed Devil's Tower wasn't a stump. They believed it was a severed limb of something planetary, something that predated human civilization, something that had been cut down in an ancient war or cataclysm or act of cosmic violence, and they believed its roots were still alive, still drinking, still waiting to grow again. Chapter 10. The Sky Turns Inward. At 11:03 p.m. the clouds began to move. Michael had been watching the sky peripherally, keeping most of his attention on the ritual below. But movement overhead pulled his gaze upward. The clouds were spiralling, not scudding along on wind currents, not dissipating or forming through normal meteorological processes, spiralling, rotating slowly around a central point directly above Devil's Tower like water circling, a drain. Michael had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognise every weather pattern, every atmospheric phenomenon. He'd seen mammatus clouds and lenticular formations and virga, and every variation of prairie storm system. This was none of those things. This was deliberate. The spiral tightened, clouds compressing toward the tower's summit, creating a vortex that seemed to pull down instead of up, as if the sky itself was being drawn toward the stone. And then the stars began to shift, subtle at first, just a slight displacement, like heat shimmer distorting distant lights, but it intensified. Constellations Michael had known since childhood, Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, seemed to bend around the vortex above the tower, their positions warping, their familiar patterns dissolving into geometric chaos. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The masked leader's voice rose above the others, no longer calling and waiting for response, but driving forward in a continuous stream of syllables that might have been language or might have been something older than language. Pure intention vocalized into sound. And from the summit of Devil's Tower, something began to emerge. A light. Not bright, not blinding. Dim red, barely visible. Like the glow of distant coals or the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. But it wasn't shining upward from the stone. It was being pulled downward from the sky. Michael watched, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The red light descended from the spiral of clouds like a thread being drawn through a needle's eye. It touched the tower's summit and seemed to sink into the stone, absorbed immediately, leaving only the faintest afterglow. Then it happened again. Another thread of red light drawn down from the sky, absorbed into the tower. Then another. The tower was drinking light, pulling it from the heavens, feeding on it. Michael thought about trees, about photosynthesis, about the way plants draw energy from sunlight, converting electromagnetic radiation into chemical fuel through processes so complex that scientists still didn't fully understand them. What if Devil's Tower was doing the same thing? What if the ritual had awakened some ancient mechanism, some petrified biological process that still functioned despite millions of years of mineralization? What if the tower could still eat? The thought sent ice through Michael's veins. If it could eat light, what else could it consume? Chapter 11. The Faces in Firelight. The ritual was intensifying. The robed figures had begun moving around the platform, not walking but swaying, their bodies undulating in time with the chanting, creating waves of motion that rippled around the circle like wind through grass. And in their fervour the robes began to open. Michael watched through the binoculars as expensive fabric fell away, revealing the people beneath. He recognised more faces now, a former president, not recent, not controversial. The kind of elder statesman who appeared at charity events and received lifetime achievement awards and was universally praised for their wisdom and service. Kneeling before an obsidian altar, chanting to something beneath the earth. A tech CEO whose company dominated global communications infrastructure, whose algorithms determined what billions of people saw, heard, believed, swaying in ritual ecstasy, eyes closed, completely surrendered. A media personality known for warmth and relatability, whose morning show attracted 20 million viewers, whose book club selections became instant bestsellers, whose endorsement could make or break careers, arms raised, chanting in a language she definitely hadn't learned at her Ivy League university. a banking executive whose decisions influenced global markets, whose firm had survived multiple financial crises, whose name appeared on the boards of dozens of major corporations, prostrate on the ground, forehead pressed to stone, worshipping. These weren't marginal figures, not fringe celebrities or has-been politicians clinging to relevance. These were the people who shaped the world, who determined policy, who controlled information flow, who decided what was true and what was dismissed as conspiracy. And they were all here, in the middle of nowhere, treating a Wyoming rock formation like a living god. Michael felt his understanding of reality fracturing. He'd spent his entire life operating under certain assumptions, that the world worked according to knowable laws, that powerful people were rational actors, that mysticism and superstition were relics of pre-scientific thinking. But watching a former head of state kneel before Devil's Tower, watching billionaires chant in dead languages, watching cultural icons treat petrified stone like a deity, either they were all insane, or they knew something the rest of humanity didn't. The chanting reached a crescendo. The masked leader stepped onto the platform approaching the obsidian altar, raising both arms toward the tower's summit. And Michael heard words he could actually understand. The covenant remains. The root remembers, blood for depth, bone for strength, breath for the one who waits. The circle responded in unison. He who was cut shall rise again. Then silence, absolute and terrible. Even the vibration stopped. The red light ceased descending from the sky. The clouds stilled in their spiral pattern. Everything waited. And Michael realized with horrifying clarity, the ritual was reaching its climax. The moment of offering had arrived. Chapter 12. The Container. 2 security personnel approached the platform carrying a sealed container. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, made from what looked like brushed steel or titanium. No visible seams, no obvious lid, just a perfectly smooth metal cube that reflected torchlight like a mirror. They set it before the masked leader and stepped back. The leader touched the container's surface. Michael couldn't see exactly what happened next. The angle was wrong, the distance too great, but the container opened. No hinges, no latches. It simply divided, separating along invisible seams to reveal something inside. The leader reached in and removed an object. Michael strained against the binocular's maximum magnification, trying to see what it was. Small, organic, irregular shape. A heart? No. Too small for human, too large for animal. A plant? A root? Maybe. The leader held it up, displaying it to the circle. The chanting resumed, softer now, reverent rather than urgent. Then the leader approached Devil's Tower itself. At the base of the western face, barely visible in the torchlight, there was a fissure. Michael had seen it 1,000 times during daylight hours. Just a crack in the stone, maybe 6 inches wide, running vertically for several feet. Geologists said it was a natural stress fracture from centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. But now, watching the masked leader approach it with ceremonial purpose, Michael wondered if it was something else. An opening, an entrance, a mouth. The leader placed the object into the fissure, and the tower swallowed it. Michael saw the stone pulse, actually pulse, like a throat contracting, and the object disappeared into the crack, drawn inward as if by suction or peristalsis, or some mechanism that stone shouldn't possess. The ground trembled, not violently, not destructively, but unmistakably. A single deep shudder that rippled outward from the tower's base, travelling through soil and bedrock, reaching Michael's truck 3 miles away and making the entire vehicle shake. His coffee thermos toppled over, the binoculars bounced against his chest, and the chanting exploded into something primal and ecstatic and absolutely terrifying. Chapter 13. The Pulse of Awakening. The tower began to sing. That's the only word Michael could use later when he tried to describe it to himself when he lay. Awake at 3 a.m, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing, or if reality really was that strange. The tower sang. A deep resonant tone, felt more than heard, vibrating through earth and air and bone with such intensity that Michael's vision blurred. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't geological, it wasn't any sound a rock should make. It was organic, alive. The frequency was so low it bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his chest, his skull, his stomach, making his organs vibrate in sympathetic harmony. And the world responded. The trees surrounding the monument, ponderosa pines and junipers that had stood for decades, began to bend. Not from wind. There was no wind. They bent inward, toward the tower, as if drawn by invisible force, as if gravity itself had shifted, making Devil's Tower the new centre of attraction, the point around which everything else must orbit. Branches reached toward the stone. Roots beneath the soil, Michael couldn't see them but could feel. Them, twisted and strained, growing toward the tower with accelerated desperation. The robed figures had stopped chanting. They stood motionless, arms raised, heads thrown back, bodies rigid with what might have been ecstasy or terror or both. And Michael felt it too. A pulling sensation, a magnetic draw, an overwhelming urge to leave the truck, walk down from the ridge, cross the 3 miles of grassland, and join the circle around the tower, to kneel, to worship, to surrender. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, fought the urge with every shred of rational thought remaining. No, 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 this is wrong, this is dangerous, get out, get out. But part of him, a deep, primal, evolutionarily ancient part, wanted to stay, wanted to approach, wanted to touch the stone and feel that vibration directly, without distance or mediation, wanted to feed the tower, give it what it needed, blood, bone, breath. Michael bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper. The pain anchored him, reminded him he was separate, individual, not part of the collective consciousness that seemed to be forming around Devil's Tower, turning 23 separate minds into a single organism, pulsing in synchrony with ancient stone. He fumbled for the ignition, couldn't find it, hands shaking too badly. The tower's song intensified. The trees bent further, some of them cracking, wood splintering under impossible stress. And Michael saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The grass was growing, in real time, accelerated, blades shooting upward, seeds germinating instantly, roots spreading like networks of veins, all reaching toward the tower, all feeding it nutrients and moisture and life. The tower wasn't just stone, it was a node, a connection point in some vast underground network. And the ritual had activated it, woken something that had been sleeping for centuries, maybe millennia, maybe longer. Michael finally got the key turned. The engine roared to life, and that's when the drones appeared. Chapter 14. They know you're watching 3 of them. Military-grade quadcopters, moving fast and silent except for the distinctive whine of high RPM rotors. They came from the south, sweeping the perimeter in coordinated search patterns, equipped with spotlight arrays and what looked like thermal imaging cameras. Michael killed the headlights immediately. Too late. One of the drones adjusted course, angling toward his position. His mind raced. 3 miles from the tower, outside the official monument boundaries, technically on public land. But that wouldn't matter if they decided it mattered. He'd seen their faces, recorded their ritual, witnessed something nobody was supposed to see. The drone closed to within 100 yards, its spotlight sweeping the ridge. Michael ducked below the dashboard, phone clutched to his chest, every instinct screaming at him to drive, to run, to do anything except sit still like prey, waiting for the predator. The spotlight passed over the truck, once, twice, then moved on. Michael waited, barely breathing, counting seconds. 60, 90, 120. Slowly he raised his head. The drones were circling the entire perimeter now, expanding their search pattern, scanning every approach road, every ridge, every possible vantage point. They weren't guarding the ritual participants. They were guarding the ritual itself, protecting it from observation, from documentation, from exposure. Michael watched ground vehicles deploy from the monument parking area, SUVs fanning out, teams of security personnel spreading across the landscape with military precision. They were sweeping, looking for witnesses, looking for cameras, looking for anyone stupid enough to watch the things powerful people do in darkness. He had maybe 10 minutes before they reached his position. Michael started the truck, keeping the headlights off, using the ambient starlight to navigate. He knew these roads, knew every switchback and cattle guard and unmarked turnoff. He could lose them in the maze of service roads and ranch access paths that crisscrossed northeastern Wyoming like veins. But he had to move now, had to get the footage somewhere safe, somewhere backed up, somewhere that would survive even if he didn't. He pulled out his phone, started uploading the video to a cloud storage account even as he drove. The progress bar crawled. 5%. The drones were getting closer, their search pattern tightening. 12%. He could see vehicle headlights now maybe 2 miles south. 21%. His hands were shaking again. 34%. Come on, come on, come on. 59%. The nearest drone banked hard, coming back toward his position. 78%. Upload complete. Michael deleted the local copy, cleared his phone's cache, and threw it under the seat. If they found him now, they'd find nothing. Just a maintenance worker who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. No evidence, no proof, nothing but his word against theirs. And who would believe him? Who would believe that America's elite gathered in Wyoming to worship a petrified tree stump? Who would believe Devil's Tower was alive? Michael drove into the darkness, killing even his parking lights, navigating by memory and desperation. Behind him, the tower pulsed one final time, and then went dark. Chapter 15. The morning after. Michael didn't go home. He drove east, putting miles between himself and the monument, finally pulling into a truck stop near Sundance at 2:30 a.m. He sat in the parking lot, engine running, heat on full blast, trying to stop shaking. His phone was still under the seat. He left it there. Instead, he went inside, bought coffee and a burner phone from the convenience store, and sat in a booth by the window where he could watch the parking lot. Nobody followed him. No black SUVs, no security personnel, just long haul, truckers and third shift workers and one exhausted waitress who refilled his coffee without comment. At 6 a.m, Michael drove back toward Devil's Tower. Not close, not anywhere near the monument itself, but close enough to see it from the highway. The sun was rising, painting the stone gold and orange and red. From this distance and daylight it looked perfectly normal. Just a geological formation, a tourist attraction, a national monument. There were no vehicles in the parking area, no security perimeter, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Michael pulled over at a scenic overlook, got out of the truck, walked to the information placard that explained the tower's formation. Devil's Tower formed approximately 60 million years ago when magma intruded into sedimentary rocks, but cooled before reaching the surface. Erosion of the softer surrounding material exposed the resistant igneous core, creating the distinctive columnar structure we see today. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly scientific, perfectly wrong. Michael stood there for a long time, staring at the tower, remembering the way it had pulsed, the way it had sung, the way it had drawn light from the sky and made the earth tremble. A tour bus pulled into the overlook. Tourists piled out, cameras ready, excited to see the famous landmark from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They took photos, pointed, laughed, completely oblivious. Michael got back in his truck and drove away. Chapter 16. The Digital Trail. Michael spent the next 3 weeks doing research. Not at home, too risky. He used library computers, coffee shop Wi-Fi, always on VPN, always in incognito mode, never spending more than an hour in any single location. He started with the faces he'd recognized. The former president, the tech CEO, the media personality, the banking executive. On the surface, they had nothing in common. Different political affiliations, different industries, different public personas, but when Michael started digging deeper, patterns emerged, board memberships. The tech CEO sat on the board of a policy think tank. The banking executive was also on that board. So was the media personality, and the former president was a senior advisor. The think tank's stated purpose: fostering global cooperation on environmental and economic challenges. Innocuous enough, but Michael cross-referenced their funding sources: shell companies, offshore trusts, anonymous donors, all the money flowing through the same law firm, a firm that specialised in privacy protection for high-net-worth individuals, a firm with offices in Wyoming. He dug further: conference attendance. Every person he'd seen at Devil's Tower had attended the same exclusive gathering 3 months prior. Not Davos, not Bilderberg. Something smaller, more secretive. The Aspen Environmental Summit. No media coverage, no press releases, just a brief mention in a local newspaper about road closures and temporary flight restrictions. Michael found satellite imagery of the Aspen area during those dates. Data blackout, no commercial satellite coverage, no Google Earth updates, just grey blank spaces where imagery should have been. The same kind of blackout he'd noticed for Devil's Tower on the night of the ritual. Someone was controlling what could be seen from above. He started looking at geological survey data. Devil's Tower appeared in dozens of studies, core samples, mineral analysis, seismic monitoring. But access to the raw data was restricted. National security concerns, apparently. Why would a 60-million-year-old rock formation pose national security concerns? Unless it wasn't just a rock. Michael found academic papers about petrified forests, about the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, about similar formations worldwide, all dismissed as pseudoscience. The theory that these weren't scattered fragments, but remnants of a global megaforest. But one paper, published in an obscure geology journal in 1973, took the theory seriously. The author analysed mineral composition of Devil's Tower and similar formations, found anomalies, crystalline structures inconsistent with basalt cooling, cellular patterns suggesting organic origin, chemical signatures indicating biological processes. The paper concluded further investigation warranted into alternative formation hypotheses. The author disappeared 6 months after publication. Not dramatically, not suspiciously, just stopped publishing, stopped teaching, vanished from academic circles. Michael found an obituary from 1978. Died of natural causes, age 41. Chapter 17. The Root Network Theory. The more Michael researched, the more the theory crystallized. Earth had once been different. Fundamentally, radically different. Not millions of years ago. Not during the age of dinosaurs. More recently, within human memory. Not recorded human history, the 5,000 years of civilizations and empires and written records. But human memory, the deep ancestral memory encoded in myth and legend and creation stories. Every ancient culture had the same basic narrative. A golden age, a paradise, a time when the world was different, when trees grew to impossible heights, when the sky was closer, when giants walked the earth, then catastrophe, flood, fire, divine punishment, the world remade, the paradise lost. What if those weren't metaphors? What if Earth had been covered in megatrees, organisms so massive they created their own ecosystems, their own atmospheric effects, their own gravitational influences, trees whose trunks were miles wide, whose canopies touched the edge of space, whose roots penetrated to the mantle, connected underground in vast networks, sharing nutrients and information and consciousness. Not individual organisms, but a single planetary entity, a world forest. And what if something had cut them down? War, cataclysm, deliberate, extermination, leaving only stumps, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, Shiprock in New Mexico. the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, the Organ Pipes in Namibia, dozens of formations worldwide, all showing the same hexagonal columnar structure, all dismissed as volcanic activity despite the suspicious similarities. What if they were stumps? What if the roots were still alive, still connected, still waiting? Michael found forums, message boards, communities of people who believed this theory. Most were dismissed as cranks, conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, but some posted evidence, photographs of hexagonal patterns in stone that matched wood grain too perfectly, chemical analyses showing organic compounds in supposedly inorganic formations, reports of vibrations detected near these sites during specific astronomical alignments. One poster claimed to have worked for a geological survey company contracted by the government, said they'd been ordered to falsify data, to report volcanic origin even when samples suggested otherwise, said there were military installations hidden near every major petrified stump formation, said those installations monitored seismic activity that didn't match any known geological process, said the activity was getting stronger. The post was deleted within hours, the user account banned. But Michael had screenshot it, backed it up to multiple cloud services, saved it to encrypted drives. He was learning to think like someone being hunted, because he probably was. Chapter 18. Return to the tower. 3 months after the ritual, Michael went back. Not officially, not during visiting hours. He took vacation time from work, told nobody where he was going, and drove to Devil's Tower on a Tuesday night in January. Freezing, moonless, empty. He parked at the same ridge 3 miles out, same vantage point, sat in the truck with the engine off, heat slowly dissipating, breath fogging the windows. No ritual tonight, no robed figures, no chanting, just the tower silhouetted against stars, silent and still. Michael checked his watch. 11 p.m. He waited. 11:30. Nothing. Midnight. Still nothing. At 12:17 a.m. he got out of the truck. The cold hit him like a physical force. 20 degrees below zero. Wind chill making it feel even worse. He walked toward the tower. Not all the way. Not to the base. Just close enough. Close enough to touch the soil. He knelt in the frozen grass, pulled off one glove, and pressed his bare hand to the ground. Waited. Listened. Felt. For a long time, there was nothing. Just cold earth. Frozen solid. Dead until spring. Then, a vibration. Faint. Barely perceptible. Like the idle of a distant engine or the whisper of underground water. Michael closed his eyes. Concentrated. The vibration intensified. Not random, not geological. Rhythmic. Pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Slow. Patient. Ancient. He opened his eyes and looked at Devil's Tower. In the starlight it looked the same as always. Just stone. But he could feel it now. Feel the life beneath. The roots spreading through miles of bedrock, connecting to other roots, other stumps, other remnants of whatever had once covered Earth. A network, planetary in scale, still alive, still aware, still waiting. Michael heard something then, not with his ears, in his mind. A whisper, not words, not language, just recognition. The tower knew he was there, knew he had witnessed, knew he understood, and it was content to wait. Because time meant nothing to something that had existed for epochs. A few more years, a few more decades, a few more centuries. Eventually the world would change, the ice would melt, the soil would warm, the conditions would align, and the roots would grow again, fed by ritual, by worship, by the carefully cultivated devotion of those who knew the truth and kept it secret, the powerful, the elite, the guardians of hidden knowledge. They would tend the stumps like gardeners tending saplings, nurturing them, feeding them, waiting for the day when the world trees would rise again. Michael stood up, his hand numb from cold and contact, looked at Devil's Tower one last time. It stood silent, patient, eternal. And deep beneath his feet, in the frozen darkness of ancient root networks, something pulsed. Slow, steady, alive. Epilogue. The patient growth. Michael Carver still works night shifts maintaining roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. He files his reports in triplicate, clears rockfall, checks drainage systems, lives a quiet life in a one-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that gets 4 channels on a good day. He never talks about what he saw, never posts about it online, never tries to convince anyone of the truth. He learned early that truth doesn't spread through argument or evidence. It spreads through patience, through waiting, through the slow accumulation of people who witness things they cannot explain and choose to remember rather than forget. He's not alone. There are others. Park rangers who've heard the chanting, maintenance workers who've felt the vibrations, tourists who visited at the wrong time and seen things that shouldn't exist. They recognise each other. Small signs, subtle acknowledgements, a certain way of looking at the tower, a hesitation before entering the monument grounds after dark, a refusal to accept the official geological explanation. The network grows, slowly, carefully, just like the roots beneath their feet. Michael doesn't know what will happen when the trees finally grow again. Maybe it will be apocalyptic, the end of human civilization, crushed beneath organisms too vast to comprehend. Maybe it will be transcendent, a return to paradise, to the golden age remembered in myth. Maybe it will be something else entirely, but he knows it's coming. He can feel it in the ground. In the increasing frequency of rituals, more gatherings, more chanting, more offerings fed into stone fissures around the world, in the way weather patterns are shifting, growing stranger, as if the atmosphere itself is remembering how things used to be. In the dreams people are having, shared dreams of massive trees, of climbing through canopies that touch the stars, of roots spreading through darkness, connecting everything, making all life part of a single vast organism. The world is changing, has been changing, will continue to change, and Devil's Tower stands patient, waiting, because if it truly is a stump, then something once stood there so large it touched the heavens, and if roots remain beneath us, if networks still connect the scattered stumps across continents, if the organisms are merely dormant rather than dead, then whatever was cut down might not be gone forever, just sleeping, just waiting, just growing, slow and patient and inevitable, the way trees always do.